Teachers are natural innovators, entertainers, and problem solvers. They dream of growing old into the profession, teaching their kids. But sometimes career goals shift, and that makes opportunities outside of the classroom seem intangible. Questioning, who am I if I'm not a teacher? I'm your host, Allie Simon.
And I'm your co-host, JoDee Scissors.
And this is Teacher Shift.
Teachers are versatile professionals. But how do you harness that versatility during a career shift? Today, our guest shares their seamless transition from the classroom to the workforce development sector.
Today, our guest is Kartav Patel. He is a workforce development professional and currently serves as an apprenticeship analyst at the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. He also teaches GED courses at Dearborn Public Schools. Before transitioning to his current field, he spent 4 years as an alternative education teacher in Detroit Public Schools. Welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Allie and JoDee. Appreciate it.
Well, it's really great to have you on, and we connected as professionals in the apprenticeship space. But I want to learn more about your previous teaching background and how you ended up really where you are today. So can you start off by telling us what subject and grades you taught?
Yeah, so I went to university at Wayne State University here in Detroit, and I went into secondary education. And so that was my certifications, grades 6 through 12. And I did social studies and health. And after graduation, I actually TA'd right away. So I was a teaching assistant for our kinesiology department in health education, focusing on that for a couple of years. And then after I graduated with a master's in health education, I went into Detroit Public Schools. That was the first school district that actually called me. And it was an alternative ed school. So it's alternative adult and community ed. And that's where I started my teaching career. And so I was asked to teach both social studies and English language arts for those students that are in the high school completion program. And then the night program was the GED program. And so they kind of went hand in hand together. And so that's how I kind of started my teaching career for those 4 years.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think you may be one of the first guests on the podcast that really has that background in education. So I think it's going to be really interesting to hear how that translates into making a career shift outside of the classroom.
Yeah. So with high school completion, it was an online program, but then again, they're based on modules that were online, but then you were also required to teach those classes as well and teach content matter related to those core subjects. And so a lot of the high school completion program consisted of students that were actually 16 to 24-year-olds, or actually 16 to 21-year-olds. And they were stop-out youth, considered stop-out youth. And that was during the daytime program. And so that was a lot of fun to really kind of use an online platform at that time. This was like 2008, 9, 10, and to really try to make those core subjects, the contents, come alive in terms of a contextualized manner. And then the night program, the GED program, was a lot of fun. That had a lot of older adults, more, I would say, even above the age of 25. And those adults were working during the day and they couldn't go back and take classes during the day. So they would have to take a night program class. And so that focused mainly on the GED and passing the GED test. And at that time, it was handwritten tests. So it wasn't the national online Pearson VUE. It was actually hand, paper and pencil. And so that went year round as well and coherent with the 2 semesters within the school year. And so the reason, I guess your first question is why I shifted within that program, like within our alternative and adult community ed program, there was a lot of different angles of like career aspects. So we did host a lot of job fairs, which was very interesting. And I thought that was really cool. So we had like traditional job fairs where we had employers come in and talk about their prospective openings and the industry that they're in, whether it was healthcare related, manufacturing, construction, or IT. And those days it was kind of new to have like education and kind of like job training / workforce development kind of mix in together. It was still kind of fresh with WIO and school aid funding, but there was an opportunity there for a lot of our students to kind of see like, oh, maybe once I graduate with my high school completion or high school diploma or GED, I don't have to go to college. I can go to college, or I can wait, or let me see what's kind of like the opportunity out there in terms of the career, in terms of the market, right? And something that I want to do. And so there were some like really cool things that we took from those career resource fairs, those job fairs, that kind of allowed a lot of us teachers at the time. There's like, I think at one of the schools, we had like 6 or 7 teachers in the building, and we kind of took some of the content material from the employers and try to make it more applicable to the classroom, right? In terms of contextualizing it and just kind of like making the lesson more fun. And I think that was kind of like a cool thing to do within our programs because we had that flexibility to do that.
I think we kind of see programs like this a bit more now, is where it's really in the past been really like college readiness, college focused. But as we see, not everybody takes that track. And so districts are reconsidering how are they exposing students to different careers. And I'm even thinking about something who was on that college track, but just how narrow of a scope I had in regards to career options. And so, you know what is right in front of you, which is like what your parents do. And you go to school every day around professionals who are teachers or administrators. And so you kind of just know like really like what's in front of you. So I love that idea of bringing professionals into the educational space. But then you guys took it a step further where you were like, well, how do we integrate this into the curriculum? And I think that's really innovative, and that I love that you had the autonomy to be able to do that, because that's a big thing that kind of keeps teachers driven is having options and being able to really hone in on a really strong feeling you have and say like, I think we need to modify this to see what we can do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like with any program, if it's a K through 12 or alternative ed or adult ed, there's performance measures, right? So you try to figure out, your program is supposed to meet these standards by the state, right? And by the feds. And you're trying to meet those performance goals, but you're trying to make it as innovative as possible and make learning fun, obviously, but then also make sure that the students get the most out of it. And so having that autonomy, like you mentioned, in the classroom in our programs was awesome, while teaching the content as well. And within those few years, you kind of saw like more of that like fusion of both workforce training and education, academic, in the classroom. It started shifting more into like more of a blended approach in terms of the classroom. But again, it was still kind of new at that time. At least it was getting to that point where, that there needed to be more of that. And like you mentioned, college wasn't for everybody. And even when I went to high school, I wouldn't say that I was college ready. I was not maybe the most studious student until like later on in my like junior year, just trying to, kind of have to figure out what I wanted to do. But like you said, we were only exposed to what was in your home, like who was working on what job, or your neighbors or your friends' parents, or even like at the school, you got teachers, nurses, counselors, right? You had administrators and all that. So we really weren't exposed to like the different careers that were out there. So we were trying to make sure that we took those employers that came to our schools and make sure that they were offered like, hey, look, this is what they're doing. This is what they're offering. These are just choices. These are opportunities. And if you're interested, there's connections here that we can make.
Yeah, it seems like your transition into, apprenticeship programs was not as drastic because you were doing that essentially as an educator. And I guess this is more like questions for both you and Allie when I'm thinking about the way that you're describing this, because I don't necessarily know if like working in apprenticeship, I didn't even know that was like a job. So you guys both kind of have this really unique experience where you shifted into this area. So what was kind of like the catalyst for that shift, or the inspiration, or maybe it was like a life event in the way that Allie kind of had a life event shift. So from both of you, like what was it like stepping into that field?
Well, like you mentioned it, for me personally, it was almost a seamless transition because everything we did in the classroom was considered apprenticeship readiness or pre-apprenticeship, right? We don't think of, I mean, maybe we do now more so than when I was growing up in high school, like, oh, career would come during college years or something like that, right? Or like post high school. Whereas there was a time where careers were like career tech, like CTE programs, right? And other career programs were being taught in the classroom. You had exposure to it. That kind of like, and when I graduated like over 20 some years ago, which kind of shows my age now, but it was really more of a college push, right? Here in Michigan. And so I wasn't as exposed to that. So when I started my teaching career, it was interesting because you saw what you could do as innovation in the classroom, and then you realize, oh, this is all pre-apprenticeship. And one of the things that probably inspired me to shift from like the classroom from a school district to a nonprofit, which is in between my years of working at the state and the school district, was a program called Youth Build. And just the youth build training model was very exciting. And I thought it was very innovative too. And it's been around since the 70s, right? Since the late 70s. I just thought that was such a really cool way to integrate education, job training, and those wraparound services for those students that need that so that they can be successful. And then you're also rebuilding, rehabbing homes, you're doing other things. It's not even just related to construction. You're not just stuck with construction. You can do other programs, other industries with Youth Build, which I thought was really cool. And so when I went to the nonprofit managing youth programs over in Southwest Detroit, we had a Youth Build grant and we had other youth programs. So we actually did do a lot of those construction trade programs, and we rehabbed a lot of affordable housing for the community.
That's amazing. I love to hear that. I can see Allie like nodding her head. She has a lot of connections with what you're saying. So, Allie, did you have, drawing from your experience as a teacher and when you went into youth apprenticeship programs, did you see any parallels between like what you did as a teacher and kind of supporting that program?
I definitely did not have the same parallels that Kartav did. And like, honestly, for me, it just all made sense when I learned about it. It was more like, why aren't we doing this more? Because what I saw in high schools, I was a high school Spanish teacher, was really this big push towards college. And it wasn't exposing students through different programs, like whether it was Youth Build or pre apprenticeship or career and technical education. And to a certain degree, even now, where the work that I do, I think still a lot of the programs are almost like, I don't want to say siloed, but you're either going to a traditional high school or you're at, a technical high school, or you're in a special program within a high school. But I really think that these activities could be more embedded and they could be honestly talked about even sooner, which I think is something that is a big discussion point right now, like moving down from just high school to talking about career learning in middle school and even elementary school. And that's the work that I'm engaged in now has moved into more of that broader space. But I love the apprenticeship model. I'm glad that you brought up Youth Build because I think that's a program that really not a lot of people know about unless you've worked with a program like that. So for our listeners, definitely Google Youth Build. It's a great program that does exist and it's just grown so much. But I think, when the practicality of actually bringing in more career learning for young people at an earlier age is just so important. And we know that there are lots of other paths to high paying jobs besides just college with the work that has been going on, especially I'd say within probably the last 5 to 10 years. So I think, it was interesting to hear about the shift to the nonprofit and looking at basically your experience. How did you kind of grow within that nonprofit? And maybe like what do you think allowed you to do that? Do you feel like having that, we call it the teacher brain, but like there's teacher brain skills, there's skills that you learn from being in the classroom, right? That carry over, I think, to a lot of the careers that we transition into. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Being a teacher in a classroom, any kind of classroom, you're a teacher of whatever subject it is or whatever material you're teaching. I mean, it transfers over to really any job, any industry, because what you learn from a practical standpoint from a university prep center and then classroom experience, you learn how to deal with challenges and obstacles. You learn how to deal with management, behavior management. You learn how to problem solve, right? Critically think about solutions to help your students achieve and be the best versions of themselves they can possibly be, and even help set goals. Those students that are just not interested in learning right now, or they're just, they don't know what they want, or they kind of do, but then, you want to bring it out of them to say, hey, look, what are you interested in, right? Yeah, those skill sets, they transfer in any industry, right? They're people skills. Teachers have a lot of empathy. I thought that was probably my greatest strength, is being very empathetic. just being able to identify myself in my students' shoes, being through what they've been through as well in various scenarios, right? That kind of transferred over into the nonprofit because that was my next move in terms of a career growth, in terms of administration, like administering grant programs, administrating programs, developing programs, really developing that training, that program model for that nonprofit so that it could be sustainable, right? So even fundraising, that whole aspect, just making sure like, oh, okay, this is how these dollars work, these restricted dollars work because they come from the government or they come from philanthropy or these are individual donors, right? So that kind of, those teaching skills kind of help me keep those relationships with those funders too, because that's all, making sure that you're able to keep a positive relationship. And then also if things don't necessarily go your way within your, in terms of your nonprofit program, how to deal with those challenges there, right? Like, okay, how can we come together and make this challenge turn into now, okay, we've got a solution for it. Those happened a lot. And I was there for about 9.5, maybe 10 years. We worked with a lot of different partners. So for those in nonprofits right now, they would know that it's just not one organization. You're working with lots of organizations, a lot of stakeholders at the table that all contribute to that program, right? And those resources that help your program grow and help sustain and really help cultivate a positive culture. That's the key right there. It was a pretty good transition. I would say that your teacher skills will always translate to a lot of different industries just because of that ability to relate to individuals and then foster that positive vibe.
I love seeing a teacher, what we mentioned, a teacher brain, like go into another sector, but see that teacher brain, those skills, that knowledge, that perspective, like really flourish. You mentioned problem solving, and I think that teachers are really good problem solvers, not just, we're talking like curriculum, behavior management, or a lack of resources. Like they're always trying to think of ways to improve the learning environment. And sometimes that means being inventive, being innovative. And so when, you think about this special ability of educators who can bring a different perspective, who can look at adults and see not just an adult, but see like disabilities, you can see needs, you can see like, you kind of like revert back and see like, oh, I understand. I get this adult because they're like this student. And so when you are like, making that shift into a new workforce, how do you like use your perspective as a teacher, your knowledge to be able to work with diverse adults, diverse groups of people to, help them start their career, to help them be successful?
Yeah, like you mentioned, as teachers, we tend to use that perspective of like, oh, I've had this experience before, right? With a student. There's always that relatable moment from a student to an adult, right? Like working direct service with teenagers versus working classroom with adults that have a lot of experience and work experience and life experience, and then working with stakeholders in a nonprofit, mainly adults with program development, implementation, and even at the state level, right? Working with other state level entities. I think that's one aspect right there. I would also say it's just really just trying to get to know people. That's really just what teachers do. They try to get to know the individual and just try to learn more about them so that they can better understand their perspective and where they're coming from. I think, as when we did like teacher school and all that, and we did behavior management in a classroom, they kind of taught you kind of like the framework principles and how to like really be able to take control of the classroom. You take what you can, right? It's really about the experience. It's really about once you get into the classroom with your pre-student teaching and your student teaching and how you're going to, handle different situations. That kind of plays a huge role. And so I'm very like in terms of relating to individuals, I like to make sure I make eye contact, right? That's one of the big things that I do now is still when I have meetings or Zoom meetings, I want to make sure I have eye contact and they know that I'm there and I'm listening, right? Because I actually am listening to you and what you're saying. And they talked about making sure you move around in the classroom. I guess when we're at these in-person meetings now, I want to make sure that we're also be able to move and be mobile and all that. Kind of make sure that you're present, show you're present there, and saying that, hey, I'm here to listen, and your perspective is important. And I want to, kind of understand it, and being able to connect like any teacher can with their student. I mean, that's the ultimate goal because once you can connect with your student, you have their attention, and it's the same concept in a corporation, right? Or wherever. Like if you're able to connect with your employees, able to connect with your key partners or new partners, it just makes the relationship so much better. And you're able to kind of bounce off ideas and you're able to have disagreements without conflict.
What I'm hearing is like relationship building, which is one of the most essential skills of an educator. And I find myself in the workforce in just like everyday social situations where there's kind of these two options. You can relationship build or you can steamroll and, and just like, force something. And I'm not the steamroll personality. I'm like relationship first. And I know that in some collaborations, sometimes that kind of forceful approach is what they want from me. And I oftentimes do not take that approach because in the long term, the relationship is much more fruitful. It is much more collaborative and the relationship lasts much longer. And I also don't want people to be afraid to ever approach me. I always want to be an approachable person, which is one of the personality traits I tried to convey as an educator was I want to be approachable by a student, but also like their family or like an educator in the building. Like sometimes I have like this like resting bee face, which doesn't help me, but I have to, put on my smile and just make sure that if someone doesn't know me, that like I am approachable.
That is also a good point you just brought up, being approachable. And like that's something that I've always tried to be as well. And it's hard sometimes because sometimes people are like, oh, you had this really sharp look when you're, intense look. But I was like, no, I was just listening intently right during the meeting. So it's kind of like, no, you can always ask me questions. You can always approach me. It's interesting now as I continue on in this career path with state government. And if somebody at a conference knows that you work for the state, they have this idea of like, oh, okay, this person's from the state. And like, no, I'm not really like, I'm very approachable, very flexible. I'm not like, this is what I do. This is my passion. I'm very fortunate to be working in state government, doing this type of work because I love doing it and the work is good. And I love the people that I work with. So you can always come and ask me questions, right? I feel like they'll be like, oh, maybe I should go to somebody else in between us or go to, like, no, you can always ask me questions. Whatever you need, like I'm here to help and my colleagues are here to help too. And we can help facilitate that connection, like what you're looking for to build your programs, right? To get you connected to an apprenticeship program to help serve the community that you're serving, right? So being approachable is definitely a key that I try to do as well.
I do feel like when you're coming from like the state level or someone's at the state level government, that it can feel like that. And I will say that, having the background that you do, if people know that, I'm sure it makes you seem a lot more approachable. Like if they know that you had a really, what I think, natural progression going from, being in the classroom and then moving into nonprofit work that was working on workforce development and working with programs and then moving into the state level. But it is hard. Like on paper, I think we make a lot of assumptions about people. And so trying your best to communicate, whether it's through eye contact, whether it's through, verbally saying like, oh no, please come to me. I never really felt like you weren't approachable. So I do think you did a good job. We've been on a lot of like live events together and we did get to meet in person, which was great. Time that we've done a big youth apprenticeship grant program. But no, I do think that hearing your story and really learning about the progression that you had professionally, I'm wondering if you could share for others that are considering a career shift, and maybe it is into the workforce development or apprenticeship space. What advice would you give them about navigating that transition and finding success in a new field?
Well, I would just say, just give it a shot. Try doing what you want. I mean, follow your passion, right? So you start off as a teacher. I find with some of my former peers that were in teacher school with me, some of them dropped out, right, during pre-student teaching, which is totally fine because they realize, hey, I can teach, I can understand the content, the subject matter, I can put it down on paper, but man, when I'm in the classroom, I just get too nervous or I just don't know what I'm doing or I just don't feel like I'm the right person to do this, right? And then sometimes even after a few years, you might get burnt out, right? Like as a teacher, depending on where you're at, you're going to get burnt. Actually, you're just going to get burnt out no matter what when you're a teacher because you're so invested in the success of your students and then all the admin requirements and then the parents and the guardians or all the other stuff that you have to do. You're just going to get burnt out, right? And so my advice is, okay, if you're looking for a change, but you are a teacher, I would recommend looking into workforce development, right? Because that's kind of like hand in hand, like, oh, there may be some overlapping similarities, right? In terms of like what you want to do in workforce development, job training, right? Maybe switching subjects in your teaching career, maybe moving over to CTE programs, right? Looking at adult ed as well. Adult ed is a different population to work with, and you're working with adults, and so they have huge life experience, right? So there's so many things that you could do. You could just try shadowing, like try volunteering for a workforce development agency, try volunteering at your GED program in your community, right? Just kind of like, oh, I just kind of want to see what it's like. And can you explain to me a little bit more? I would just encourage that person to do that because there's so many things that might be eye opening to you, or going to like a construction trades fair and how they work with the high schools, or even just looking at the CTE programs, like, oh, what do you teach, and what are some of your projects that you do here, and just like looking at that first, and then figure out what you want, in terms of what you want, in terms of where you want to take your next step, your career. And you might just want to be where you're at. Maybe you just wanted to see what was out there, and then you went back to teaching the same subjects that you're teaching, or maybe you make that shift. Maybe you have that courage to do, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and do this, and really, this is where I want to be in the next 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years.
I think that's really great advice. And I have to say that we are actually recording this episode during National Apprenticeship Week. So I would be remiss to not say that another thing you could consider that's really been growing a lot, and I think you would agree, is educator pathways in apprenticeship. So, if you're considering moving into apprenticeship or career and technical education, there's a lot of paraprofessional, pre-educator pathways. And I think they could use teachers to help develop those programs. You have the experience. A lot of times, one of the biggest barriers for educators in CTE programs is that they have to be like qualified to be able to teach those courses. And so if you have your degree in education, your master's degree in education, you would be a good fit for those programs. So it's just something that as you're going through this, I'm like, I would be remiss if I did not say this is something that's really growing in the US, and I think it will continue to grow. It's a great way to help solve a lot of the problems, I think, in education, which is a lot of student debt to become a teacher, which unfortunately doesn't pay as much as other careers.
And like you mentioned with apprenticeship, I mean, the assumption of apprenticeship is that it's trades, right? And it's not. Apprenticeship is really any industry. You can really do an apprenticeship program, a registered apprenticeship program from USDOL in any industry. And that's the nice thing about it. We have a lot of healthcare apprenticeship programs out there, information technology, right? We have agricultural programs, outdoor recreation. And like you mentioned, public sector, right? There's public sector with the government now. Those apprenticeships are starting to get more attention. And then teacher programs, right? Getting your foot in the door in terms of, okay, maybe I want to be a teacher, but I can't afford to go to college, or maybe I can do this teacher apprenticeship program and see what it's like, right? And it's still the same. You're still getting the same materials. You're still getting using the same certifications for each state. Nothing's changed, right? Whether you do the traditional college, or if you do like our teacher program here in Michigan, you're still getting the same academic content. You're still going through the same rigorous program to become a teacher. It's just two different pathways, right? It's just like that career ladder, like where you have on ramps, off ramps, on ramps, off ramps, or just like a detour to somewhere else, right? So that's what we're trying to do with apprenticeship, is say, hey, like apprenticeship can be a very flexible training model. They could start right away. You can start in high school. You can be 16 years old because that's the minimum age. And then you can start looking at your career at that point as a young person and say, okay, well, maybe I'm going to, by the time I'm 19, 20, I'm going to go back, I'm going to go to college for 4 years. I'm going to get this degree in business administration or whatever it is, right? But the nice thing about apprenticeship is, Allie, is that many of them do offer that college credit. So it goes hand in hand. And they're working with the universities and the community colleges. So we've been trying to break that myth of it's either apprenticeship or college. No, it's really both. You're doing both at the same time, right?
Absolutely. I think it can really be both. And what I'm hoping that our listeners get from today's episode, besides learning about your story, is that there are all of these other options and career paths and ways to get trained in professions that, frankly, I don't think all educators know about. So if you want to learn more about apprenticeship and connect with Kartav, you can find him on LinkedIn. We'll link that in the show notes for today. And I really want to thank you for being a guest today on the podcast. It was such a great conversation.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Are you interested in suggesting a topic for Teacher Shift, being a guest, or recommending a guest? Please see the episodes page on our website to make a submission. And if you'd like to write for us, see our blog page. If you liked Teacher Shift, give us a 5-star rating and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Today's episode was written and recorded by me, Allie Simon, and my co-host, JoDee Scissors. Executive produced by Teacher Shift. Produced and edited by Emily Porter. Original music, Emoji by the Tube Backer.